The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Ma'am, you've had a chance to review a statement by the defendant's father to Detective Flores, correct?
Correct.
And specifically, you have had a chance to review a portion of that statement involving the father's characterization of his daughter in terms of her truthfulness, correct?
Correct.
And there is an issue with regard to her truthfulness with regard to the father, correct, involving the defendant?
Correct.
And this issue that he has with her truthfulness is referenced with regard to the age of 14, correct, and onward?
Correct.
The issue that we discussed previously involving the defendant being a victim, portraying herself as a victim even though there was no abuse, isn't it?
Objection is to mischaracterizing the evidence.
Approach, please.
Ma'am, in Exhibit 609, we talked about an interview with Zaina Carranzo, right?
Correct.
And she's the one that talks about whether or not the defendant likes to play the victim, right?
Correct.
And one of the things that you told us about this particular incident was that this was when they were teenagers that she was referencing this, correct?
It was actually when she was younger than that.
Well, you indicated previously when you testified that they were teenagers, yes or no?
I thought they were teenagers. I was incorrect.
Well, ma'am, isn't it true that that's what you told us previously? That's all I meant.
Yes, it is true.
And so this indication that you gave previously that they were teenagers is about the same time that the father made the statement about his daughter's lack of truthfulness, correct?
I gave the wrong age, Mr. Martinez.
I'm not asking you that, am I?
Well, you're asking me to put those
Ma'am.
two things together, Mr. Martinez.
Isn't it true that previously, before the break, and whatever it is that you did during the break, you
Objection argumentative. Sustained.
previous to the break, you testified that this incident involving Zaina Carranzo occurred when they were teenagers, yes or no?
Yes, I did testify to that.
And isn't it true that the father's truthfulness references the age of 14, correct?
Yes, but
I understand that. Thank you. Now, ma'am, with regard to certain things, you told us with regard to the interview that you did go back and you did talk to the defendant about certain things, right? Specifically the anal sex, right?
I talked to her about the lubricant.
No, but my question is, do you remember that we played the clip? And
Yes.
the clip involved anal sex, right?
Right.
And you told us before the break, well, I went back and I talked to her about the anal sex, right?
I talked to her about the anal sex.
And so you did go back then and you talked to her sometime afterwards, right?
Specifically about the lubricant.
When you say specifically about the lubricant, you didn't talk to her about the anal sex then?
I talked to her about who brought the lubricant, as you asked me in our interview, who brought that you thought was important, so I went back and asked her about who brought the lubricant for the anal sex.
I'm not interested in who brought the lubricant right now.
Oh.
I'm interested in your knowledge about the defendant's dalliance or activities in anal sex. That's what I'm interested in.
All right.
With regard to that particular activity, did you go back and address that issue with the defendant to get the specifics about that? Or did your prejudices prevent you from doing that?
Objection argumentative.
Sustained.
Well, you said that you were old-fashioned, right?
Yes.
And did the fact, or was the fact that you were old-fashioned prevent you from going back and talking to the defendant about the various instances of anal sex?
With whom?
With whomever she was having anal sex.
There were different people that she tried. She tried anal sex. She didn't like it. And so Mr. Alexander, as far as I know, is the only person that she had repeated anal sex with.
But my question to you is, did you go back and talk to her about her activities involving anal sex? Yes or no?
I asked her about anal sex.
Yes or no?
Yes, I asked her about
So
anal
you went
sex.
back, and after you went back to talk to her about anal sex, did you talk to her about the anal sex involving all these other individuals, or did you just talk to her about anal sex involving Mr. Alexander?
I talked to her about anal sex with other people.
With regard to those other people, did she ever indicate to you that she had anal sex with Mr. Juarez?
I did not talk to her about Mr. Juarez.
So do you know whether or not she had anal sex with Mr. Juarez?
No, I do not.
Do you know?
No, I do not.
Would it be important in terms of this to see who's assertive, to determine who initiated the anal sex, if she in fact had it with Mr. Juarez? Would that have been important to you?
It's not important in assessing the domestic
answer is no.
violence. It's not important in assessing domestic violence, which is really what I was asked to do here.
So the answer is no. The answer is no, correct?
It would be irrelevant.
Right. And with regard to Mr. McCartney, do you know whether or not she had anal sex with Mr. McCartney?
She said
She said?
She said that they had attempted anal sex and she didn't like it.
How about with Mr. Brewer? Did you talk to her about having anal sex with Mr. Brewer?
That they were experimented and tried it, and it was not something that either one of them pursued, nor did she pursue it with Mr. McCartney.
But there was at least two, as far as you know, there were 2 attempts at it, correct? Is that what you're telling me?
There were attempts.
Right, I used the word attempt, so there were
Yeah.
2 attempts, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And they never went anywhere, I guess is the point. In other words, it wasn't consummated, for lack of a better term.
It wasn't pursued.
And they didn't go forward with it, right?
They didn't continue having anal sex.
Are you saying they only had it once and didn't continue having it?
I don't know how many times they had it. That was not relevant. What was relevant was that it was not enjoyable and they did not continue it as a practice.
And that illustrates that if there's an area out there to discuss and you don't think it's important, then you won't discuss it, right?
If it doesn't feel relevant to the domestic violence aspect of it, because I was retained to look at domestic violence, that's what I did, Mr. Martinez. I looked at domestic violence.
So if it doesn't feel relevant, then it's a feeling that you have about whether or not it's relevant. And if it doesn't feel relevant, then you don't pursue it, right?
If it isn't relevant, I don't pursue it.
You used the word feel. Do you remember just using that?
If it isn't relevant, I don't pursue it.
And the person who makes the determination, the gatekeeper about whether or not it's relevant, is you, right?
In my assessment of domestic violence, I would be the person.
Right. It would be in what you, in your mind, believe is important, right?
What me and my experience believe is important.
Sure. You, your mind, your experience believe is important, correct?
Correct.
It could be that others may disagree with you about what is or isn't important, right?
Yes.
Speculation.
Correct?
It could, sure.
And it could also be that you may be mistaken as to what you think is important or not important, correct?
Objection, speculation.
Rolled. Anybody can be wrong.
I'm not asking about anybody. I'm asking about you.
Anybody can be wrong.
How about you? Is that a yes?
I'm sure I could be wrong.
And so in this particular case, it could be that with regard to this aspect of the anal sex and who she had it with and how it was initiated, it could be that you could be wrong about its importance, correct?
I don't believe I am.
I know you don't believe that you are, but it could be, correct?
Objection, speculation.
Overruled. Hypothetically, anything could be true, Mr. Martinez.
But you're saying in this case it isn't, right?
I'm saying I don't believe that it is.
One of the other aspects that we discussed, or that you believe, is that you are aware of the telephone conversation involving the defendant and Mr. Alexander, where they are involved in sex.
Yes.
And you indicated that you listened to that, correct?
Yes.
Did you listen to it before or after my interview with you?
I don't remember.
But you listened to it and It's your impression that that was tape recorded by Mr. Alexander, correct?
I believe it was tape recorded by Miss Arias.
Do you remember that you and I had a conversation about that, this interview back in November of 2000 and, I'll give you the exact date.
2004,
November 14th of 2012. Do you remember that we had a conversation about that on November 14th of 2012?
Yes,
And during that time, we discussed your understanding of who had taped that conversation, right?
yes.
Do you remember that you gave me a different answer?
You've got the paper there.
Yes
I've
or
got-
no? I'm asking what you remember, ma'am. Do you remember
I
giving...
don't remember. I don't remember.
So the answer is you don't remember giving me a different answer.
I don't remember giving you a different answer, but I believe that what you've got on that paper is correct, and I could have, because I didn't know everything when I had that interview with you.
Ma'am, you had already formed an opinion when I interviewed you back in November 14th of 2012, right?
I formed a partial.
No, do you remember that we discussed it and you said that you already had an opinion? Do you
I had
remember
an
telling-
opinion about domestic violence, and yes, I did.
And in fact, do you know what date this trial started?
Objection, relevance argumentative.
Overruled.
Do you know?
What date this trial started?
Right.
It started at the beginning of this year.
No, didn't jury selection, do you know
Well,
that?
jury selection started in December,
Of what year?
last year,
What year? Give us, is it 2012?
2012.
Right. And in December, barely a month before this trial was to start, you and I discussed your opinion, didn't we?
In November.
Yes, about a month before this trial was to start, right?
Yes,
And during that time, you gave me all the information that you had at that point, didn't you?
exactly.
So what you're saying is you had already done all of this work. You already had reached your opinion, and yet you then went and did some other work?
I did some other work.
Why is it that when you spoke to me, you already had the impression, or not the impression, the opinion that the defendant was a victim of domestic violence?
Because I had read numerous, in the paper, and I'm not sure which is the IM and which is the text.
You had read material.
I had read a lot of written material. I had looked at a lot of the collateral. I read the collateral data, and I believed I had enough information, but I hadn't read everything. I think I hadn't read some of the text messages or something. I hadn't read everything.
But if you already had an opinion, then what's the purpose of going to continue doing an assessment in this case after you and the prosecutor had an interview?
Because the more information I can get, the better. And if I find confounding information, or I find something, but the more information I have, the better, to create a better context. So as long as I can.
So are you saying that when you spoke to the prosecutor in November 2012, you were unprepared to give an opinion as to whether or not the defendant suffered from domestic violence in this case?
No, I didn't say that.
Your opinion was complete when we spoke. You said that in your opinion, the defendant was the victim of domestic violence, right?
Correct.
And you had reviewed whatever it was that you had reviewed up to that time, right?
Correct.
And you had looked at all of the corroboration that you had taken a look at, right?
Correct.
And based on all of that, you and I had this discussion, right?
Yes, we did.
And it's an absolute opinion that you had. In other words, you weren't waffling when you spoke to the prosecutor about this. You were certain of your opinion back in November 2012, right?
Yes, I was.
If you're already certain about your opinion when you're talking to the prosecutor, what's the purpose of going back? Well, there is no purpose served in going back and doing more work on this case if you already have an opinion, is there?
There is to me.
How can that possibly be if you've already reached an opinion? That's an
Because
absolute.
the more
isn't it?
information I have, the better off I am. The more information I have, it just keeps being helpful to add information. I do that in all my cases. I don't stop gathering information.